So this is a series of lectures on Chapter 2, which is the chemistry of life. And before we get started on this, I just want to remind you that you should pull up from the Moodle website the notes and the review questions for Chapter 2. And you're going to want to have those handy. As you listen to the lectures, I'd like to have you actually take notes using the outline that I provide for you. And a lot of times students like to see the review questions kind of along while they're listening, because they can then sort of begin to connect, oh, here's the answer to this question, here's the answer to this question. So my suggestion is have both of those handy, both the outline and the review questions. And once again, for every chapter, I will give you an outline and review questions that then you will use as you work your way through the lectures. So this chapter is roughly divided into 3 parts. The first part includes sort of basic chemistry, sort of between, let me just fix that a little bit, going between 2.1 and 2.4. So we'll talk about matter, the composition of the atom, and chemical bonds. Then the second part is discussing water. So it talks about the properties of water, and then we also have a discussion about pH. And then the third part is really talking about organic chemistry. And that's what you see here, all the way down to here. And with that includes at the end a discussion of enzymes, which are important types of proteins that help to catalyze chemical reactions. So let's begin. So opening questions: what are you made of? What am I made of? What is your desk made of? What's a tree made of? What's the universe made of? Well, that has something to do with this idea of matter. So it's not like what's the matter type of matter. It's the idea that matter is anything that occupies space and has mass. And matter on Earth is found in 3 physical states: gas, liquid, and solid. So if you think about, for example, water can exist in a gaseous form, a liquid form, and a solid form. Now, chemistry is the scientific study of matter. And it's really important for us to have a basic understanding of chemistry so that we can understand biology, because a lot of important biological processes have to do with understanding chemistry. I know a lot of the students in this class are interested in anatomy and physiology, and certainly to understand physiology, you absolutely need to understand chemistry. So we'll start with talking about atoms and molecules. Now, atoms are the smallest units that retain all the properties of their type of matter. And then atoms are usually bonded to each other to form molecules. So down below in this diagram, you can see a molecule of propane gas, and these smaller white balls are represent the hydrogen atoms, and the larger gray balls represent the carbon atoms. And then this is called a ball and stick model, and the sticks that look like little toothpicks, those are the chemical bonds, or they represent the chemical bonds. Now, all matter is composed of individual elements. So matter is whatever takes up space and has mass, and matter is composed of these different types of elements. And an element is a basic substance that can't be broken down. So, for example, sodium is an example of an element. And the smallest amount of an element, the smallest unit of an element, is called an atom. Now, individual elements will combine to form compounds. So, table salt, what you sprinkle on your food, and what also under certain conditions can help increase your blood pressure. Table salt is an example of a compound. So a compound is made up of 2 or more types of elements. In this case, table salt is made up of sodium atoms and chlorine atoms. And when these 2 atoms combine, they actually form the compound sodium chloride, which is table salt. And a little bit later, we'll talk about the bonding that occurs between these 2 elements that ends up creating this compound sodium chloride. So let's just talk a little bit about chemical reactions. The whole idea of chemical reactions is that matter can be rearranged, but it can't be created or destroyed. So in a chemical reaction, you will have reactants on the left-hand side. Those are the chemicals that you are starting with. And then you will have the products on the right-hand side. And basically, in a chemical reaction, you have sort of a rearrangement of matter. Some bonds are broken, new bonds are formed. So let's talk a little bit about how we organize matter, sort of elements. How do we organize our understanding of elements? And there's lots of different ways to classify objects. The periodic table of the elements is one way to classify objects and organize them in a way that makes it easier to understand them. And we're going to take a little bit of time to talk about the periodic table. So here is the periodic table, and one of the things that you will notice about the periodic table is that every element has a particular number, and that number is called the atomic number. And the periodic table organizes the elements according to each element's atomic number. And every element has a unique atomic number. So here's an example of an element, carbon. So carbon is very, very important for biological systems. We basically are made up of lots and lots of carbon compounds that we'll talk about in a little bit. But let's just talk about the element carbon. So this is going to be important for you to understand for both lecture and lab. And so you want to make sure that you can work with elements and be able to tell where the atomic number is, where the atomic weight is, and that's also going to give us important information when we start to discuss subatomic particles. So if I haven't already mentioned, hopefully while you guys are listening to this, you have your notes in front of you, and you are actually writing notes on these PowerPoint slides. So with the carbon element, the number that's the smaller number is, and in this case, sometimes it's found in different spots, but in this book, it's found up at the top. That's right here. This is the atomic number. And the atomic number corresponds to the number of protons in the carbon atom. So each element has a unique atomic structure with a unique number of protons. And protons are a type of subatomic particles that we'll talk about a little bit later. So the atomic number is very, very important because it's unique to each element. Now down at the bottom, you have the atomic weight. The atomic weight corresponds to the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. Now you can see here this says 12.01 and you're like, well, wait a second. If you have 6 different protons, then would you have 6.01 neutrons? That probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you. And the answer is no. This atomic weight is actually a weighted average. There are different forms of carbon. There's carbon 12, carbon 13, and carbon 14. And the periodic table reflects a weighted average of those different carbon atoms that are found. And so when we actually try to figure out the number of neutrons, we're going to just work with the whole numbers. So in this case, this carbon would have an atomic number of 6. So it would have 6 protons, and it would have 12 minus 6, which is 6 neutrons. So let's talk a little bit about the elements that are the most important for cells, for living things. Well, it turns out if you were to analyze what elements are found in cells and living organisms, there are 4 elements that make up over 96% of living cells. And those 4 elements are oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. Okay? Now there's different ways that you can kind of try to remember this, because this is something you should remember. For some reason, I try to remember this where I say CHON, which is C-H-O, N, and I know that's really messy, but that's CHON. I just remember as carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And those are the 4 elements that make up over 96% of living things. Now maybe you can think of a better way to remember the CHON, and if you have a good one, email me and I can use it the next time I teach this. All right, then the next group of elements are required in smaller quantities, a little bit less than 4%. But some of these elements you probably are familiar with. One is calcium, right? Calcium is found in our bones. We have to drink milk with calcium to strengthen our bones. Phosphorus, potassium. For example, bananas have a really good source of potassium. Sulfur, sodium, right? That we've already talked about. Sodium chloride, which include the elements sodium and chlorine, and magnesium. So these 7 elements are found in a little bit less than 4% of living things. And then the last group of elements, there are 14 elements that are found in really, really small amounts. And those are called trace elements. Now you can see from this pie chart or pie graph that they represent collectively about 0.1%, which is really, really, really small. But the important thing to remember with the trace elements is even though they aren't found in large quantities in the cell, in living things, they are super important for physiology. So, for example, if you look at iodine, right? So iodine is considered a trace element, but if you don't have iodine in your diet, you can actually get a particular disease. That's why iodine has been added to table salt, so that we have this in our diet, even though we might not have food that contains iodine. So these trace elements, like, for example, zinc and manganese, iron, right? Iron's very important for red blood cells, for example. These trace elements are still very important, even though they're found in minuscule amounts. So going back to our periodic table, I just want to highlight that these different elements that we've talked about that are important for living cells, living organisms, are color-coded in your textbook's periodic table. So you can see that the CHON are in orange, and then the next number of important elements are in green, and then the trace elements are represented in pink. So in the next section, we'll be talking more about the structure of the atom and also about bonding.